Week 11 of the fantasy football season, and here's a few wide receivers I would start this week. The first guy, DJ Moore, the Carolina Panthers. So DJ Moore, he took a big hit a few weeks ago, and he really hasn't been the same since he got lit up in that ball game. But right here, they got a good matchup in Week 11 versus the Washington football team. Cam Newton's going to be the starter in this one, and I think him and Newton could hook up on a few passes in this ball game. So the last 3 weeks here, though, for Moore. Week 8 at Atlanta, 4 catches, 59 yards. Week 9 versus the New England Patriots, 3 catches, 32 yards, and 14 rushing yards. And then Week 10 at Arizona, only 4 catches, 24 yards. So right here with Newton in the lineup, I think we're going to see DJ Moore break out and finally have a big ball game after for many weeks he hasn't done much. And right here, he versus the Washington football team that gives up the second most fantasy points to wide receivers on the season. So I think Moore could get 70 or 80 yards and find the end zone this week. And I like him as a start, especially with this matchup. The next wide receiver I would start this week's Gerald Waddle of the Miami Dolphins. So Gerald Waddle, he's been the second best wide receiver in this rookie class, in my opinion, this season. So Waddle here, he's been solid the last 3 out of 4 weeks for PPR owners. Week 7 versus Atlanta, 7 catches, 87 yards. Week 8 at Buffalo, 4 catches, 29 yards. Week 9 versus Houston, 8 catches, 83 yards for him. And Week 10 versus Baltimore, 4 catches, 61 yards. So he's reached the double digits, like I mentioned. And now he's got a great matchup at the New York Jets that we see get torched each and every week through the air and by wide receivers, even though it's surprising to me the Jets only give up the 16th most fantasy points to wide receivers. But right here, if Tua's going to start this game, him and Waddle have a great rapport, obviously from their college football days. And right here, I think Waddle has another good ball game with maybe 7 or 8 catches and 70 or 80 yards in this one. The next wide receiver I would start this week, Beasley of the Buffalo Bills. So Cole Beasley, he's been pretty solid this year. By knowing Week 10, he didn't do anything versus the New York Jets, only with 3.5 fantasy points in PPR leagues. But the last few games before that, Week 8 versus Miami, 10 catches, 110 yards. Week 9 at Jacksonville, 8 catches, 33 yards. And then at the Jets, only the 2 catches for 15 yards. But this week, he's got a great matchup on paper versus the Indianapolis Colts that give up the 4th most fantasy points to wide receivers. And we know Cole Beasley's one of the best slot wide receivers in all of pro football. It was just a down game last week for him, but I think he gets back on track, and it wouldn't surprise me to see him score anywhere from 15 to 18 fantasy points. Because like I mentioned, this Colt team, they're very vulnerable versus the pass, and I could see a big game out of Beasley, no doubt about it, in this one. The next wide receiver is Hollywood Brown of the Baltimore Ravens. So Hollywood Brown and this whole Raven offense had a down game in a surprising loss, obviously, in Week 10 at the Miami Dolphins. But before that, he's been pretty solid the whole season, is Hollywood Brown. Week 7 versus Cincinnati, 5 catches, 80 yards, and a touchdown. Week 9 versus Minnesota, 9 catches, 116 yards. And Week 10 at Miami, 6 catches, 37 yards, but he did have 13 targets in that one. So right here in Week 11, he's got a great matchup at the Chicago Bears that give up the 5th most fantasy points to wide receivers on the season. And wouldn't surprise me if he catches a deep ball or two and finds the end zone. This Raven team, they took the Dolphins light, in my opinion. They were force-feeding too many plays to Mark Andrews and Brown in that game. A lot of bad throws by Jackson. But I think he gets right in Soldier Field in Week 11 at Chicago. And I think Hollywood Brown catches a deep ball for the end zone. And it wouldn't surprise me to see him catch 2 in this one. And the 5th and final wide receiver I would start this week, Lockett of the Seattle Seahawks. Tyler Lockett, it's been a down year for him, no doubt about it. We know he got off to the great start the first few weeks of the season. Then he teered it off. Then Wilson got hurt. And then Wilson returned in Week 10 at Green Bay. But in that ball game, he didn't do anything, was Lockett. 2 catches for only 23 yards. So right here, Lockett, he's got to get back going here for fantasy owners. And I think he will. His best game in the last 6 weeks was Week 8 versus Jacksonville. 12 catches, 142 yards. I know Arizona is pretty good on paper versus wide receivers, only giving up the 11th least amount of fantasy points to receivers on the season. But right here, I think they're going to have to throw a lot in this game, is Seattle. And it wouldn't surprise me right now if Tyler Lockett in this one gets 80 or 90 yards and finds the end zone. So that's a few wide receivers I would start here for Week 11 of the fantasy football season.